My new husband watched as his 19-year-old daughter mocked me at dinner, right in front of my own family. When I tried to defend myself, he cut me off and loudly announced that I had absolutely no say in his house. I stayed perfectly silent and smiled through the humiliation. But that night, I made one quiet decision, and by morning, their entire world had collapsed. My name is Naomi, and I am 34 years old. Everyone at that table thought I was just a modest financial advisor who got lucky marrying a wealthy investment broker. They had no idea I was actually the hidden founder of a private equity firm managing hundreds of millions of dollars. Before I tell you how I dismantled my arrogant husband and his entitled daughter in a single morning, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly plot your revenge against people who thought they could walk all over you. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, I learned early on that real power does not need to shout. The sharp clatter of heavy sterling silver hitting fine bone china echoed through the massive formal dining room. It was a harsh, violent sound that completely shattered the soft jazz playing through the hidden ceiling speakers. Chloe pushed her plate away with a dramatic, exaggerated sigh of pure disgust. The roasted lamb with rosemary and garlic, a dish I had spent 4 painstaking hours preparing after a brutal 80-hour work week, sat practically untouched in front of her. "I cannot eat this garbage," she announced, her voice dripping with the specific kind of entitlement that only comes from being spoiled unconditionally since birth. The crystal chandeliers above us cast a warm, expensive glow over the long mahogany table, but the atmosphere in the room instantly dropped to freezing. I sat at the opposite end of the table, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. My hands rested calmly on my lap, fingers loosely clasped together. I was wearing a simple tailored navy blue dress. It was elegant, unassuming, and deliberately unbranded. Chloe had just spent the last 20 minutes of our dinner dissecting my outfit, calling it a cheap knockoff from a discount store. She sat there draped in thousands of dollars of designer labels, a silk blouse, and a diamond tennis bracelet her father had purchased just last week to compensate for his constant absence during her childhood. She flipped her perfectly styled hair and rolled her dark eyes, making absolutely sure that everyone sitting at the table registered her profound disappointment with my cooking, my clothes, and my very existence. You would think that since you live here for free, you could at least learn how to cook a decent meal. Chloe said, her voice carrying easily across the large room. "But I guess you cannot buy class, and you certainly cannot fake it with that tragic dress. You look like you belong in the kitchen washing the dishes, not sitting at the head of the table pretending to be the lady of the house." I took a slow, measured breath. The air in the dining room was thick with tension, heavy with the unspoken rules of black elite society that Marcus and his daughter obsessed over. They were the kind of people who cared deeply about alumni associations, exclusive country club memberships, and projecting an image of flawless generational wealth. Marcus had always portrayed himself as a self-made giant in the investment world, a man who drove imported sports cars, wore custom-tailored Italian suits, and made sure everyone in our social circle knew he owned this sprawling 10,000-square-foot mansion in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Atlanta. He wanted a wife who would look pretty, stay quiet, and be endlessly grateful for the lavish lifestyle he supposedly provided. He thought he had found exactly that in me, a woman he believed was just a modest financial advisor pulling in a painfully average salary. I looked across the table at the faces of my own family. My mother, Valerie, sat completely frozen. She was 60 years old and utterly obsessed with the illusion of social status. She had spent my entire life pushing me to find a wealthy man to elevate our family name, and now she was too terrified of losing her connection to Marcus to speak up. My sister Maya and her white husband Brad stared at their plates, pretending they did not hear a 19-year-old girl verbally abusing me. The silence was absolute. No one stepped in. No one told Chloe to stop. I had spent 34 years trying to earn my mother's approval. I maintained straight A grades, joined honor societies, and built a respectable career, all to erase the disappointment in her eyes. Yet sitting at this table, her silence spoke volumes. She was perfectly willing to let her eldest daughter be publicly humiliated if it meant she could continue bragging to her church friends about her wealthy son-in-law. Maya was no better. As a sister, she should have been my fierce protector. But the allure of weekend trips on Marcus's yacht and the occasional designer handbag he gifted her had effectively purchased her loyalty. And Brad. Well, Brad was just a corporate parasite who viewed my suffering as collateral damage in his own quest for a promotion. They were all sitting there, breathing the same air, eating the food I prepared, and allowing a teenager to verbally eviscerate me. Chloe picked up her wine glass, taking a sip, before setting it down with another loud clink. "Honestly, Naomi," she continued, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms, "I do not even know why my father married you. You bring absolutely nothing to the table. You do not have the right connections. You do not have the right background, and your taste is just embarrassing. My friends were laughing about the cheap shoes you wore to the charity gala last week. It is humiliating for us to be seen with you." Every word was designed to cut to remind me that in her eyes and in the eyes of her father, I was an interloper, an imposter, who had somehow tricked her way into their perfect, wealthy world. She wanted to provoke a reaction. She wanted me to cry, to yell, to show them all how unrefined and emotional I could be. That was the trap she was setting. If I reacted with anger, I would be the angry, bitter woman ruining their peaceful Friday dinner. If I cried, I would be the weak, pathetic charity case who could not handle the pressure of high society. I refused to give her either. I focused my gaze on a small imperfection in the floral arrangement at the center of the table. I thought about the sheer amount of effort I had put into this evening, trying to bridge the gap between my family and my new husband's world. I had carefully selected the menu, bought the ingredients, and cooked the entire meal from scratch because Marcus insisted that a good wife should know how to host a proper dinner party without relying on caterers. I had done everything right, playing the role he had assigned me perfectly, and my reward was sitting in silence while a teenager tore my dignity to shreds for sport. The silence stretched out, becoming almost unbearable. I could hear the faint ticking of the grand clock in the hallway. I could hear the sound of my brother-in-law Brad shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair. But still not a single person uttered a word of defense. My mother took a nervous sip of her water. My sister looked at the ceiling. They were all complicit. They were all trading my self-worth for a seat at Marcus's luxurious table. Chloe smiled, a victorious, cruel little smirk spreading across her face. She thought she had won. She thought her words had crushed me into submission. She thought I was sitting there in silence because I was too ashamed and too powerless to fight back. She had absolutely no idea that my silence was not surrender. It was calculation. I was simply observing, cataloging every insult, and waiting for the perfect moment to pull the ground right out from under her designer shoes. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the expensive lace tablecloth. She clearly hated that I was not crying or begging for her approval. She wanted a visible reaction. She needed to see me break to validate her own superiority. "You know, everyone talks about you behind your back," she sneered, making absolutely sure her voice carried to every single corner of the room. "My friends, my dad's colleagues, even your own family probably. They all know exactly what you are. You are just a pathetic gold digger. You saw a wealthy, successful man, and you latched onto him because you knew you could never afford this kind of lifestyle on your own. You are living off my dad. You are eating the food his money bought, sitting in a chair his money paid for, and pretending you are somehow on our level. It is honestly pathetic." I watched her manicured fingers tap against the table. She was 19 years old, carrying a designer handbag that cost more than what most hardworking people make in 6 months, yet she possessed absolutely zero grace. She was a direct product of Marcus and his toxic parenting style. He had taught her that wealth excused terrible behavior and that a large bank account was a perfectly acceptable substitute for actual character. Brad chuckled softly into his wine glass, clearly enjoying the show. Maya kept her eyes glued to her plate, refusing to intervene. My mother, Valerie, actually nodded slightly as if agreeing that I should just accept my place as the grateful charity case of the family. The betrayal from my own blood was a sharp, twisting pain in my chest, but I refused to let it show on my face. I placed my hands flat on the table. The polished wood was cool beneath my palms. When I finally spoke, my voice was perfectly level and measured. There was no tremor, no raised pitch, no emotional cracking. "Chloe," I said softly, the sheer calm volume of my voice forcing everyone at the table to lean in slightly to hear me. There is a distinct difference between having money and having manners. I spent hours preparing this meal out of respect for our family gathering. If you do not care for the food, you are entirely free to excuse yourself from the table and order whatever you prefer. But as long as you are sitting in this dining room, you will speak to me with the basic courtesy and respect that is expected of an adult. The reaction was instantaneous. Before Chloe could even open her mouth to fire back a spoiled retort, Marcus erupted. He did not just speak. He slammed his heavy ringed hand down onto the solid mahogany table with such explosive force that a wine glass tipped over, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white lace. "Do not you dare lecture my daughter!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings of the dining room. He stood up, his tall, imposing frame towering over the end of the table. He pointed his index finger directly at my face, his eyes blazing with a toxic, unhinged fury. "Who do you think you are talking to?" he demanded, stepping out from behind his chair. "You do not get to set rules in this house. You do not get to demand respect from my child. This is my house. This is my money. These are my rules. You are just a guest here." Sus? His words were like physical blows meant to beat me down into total submission. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom Italian suit. This was the real Marcus. The charm, the smooth-talking investor persona he showed to his wealthy clients and to my social climbing mother, it was all a fragile mask. Underneath the expensive cologne and the luxury watches, he was a deeply insecure tyrant who needed to financially dominate the women in his life to feel like a powerful man. He looked at me not as a partner, not as a wife, but as an accessory he had purchased, an accessory that was currently malfunctioning by daring to have a voice. "You walked into this marriage with nothing," he spat, pointing his finger aggressively at the walls of the dining room. "Everything you see around you exists because I allow it. I pay the bills. I maintain this lifestyle. You are here because I chose to let you be here. If you ever speak to Chloe like that again, I will pack your cheap bags myself and leave you out on the curb. Do you understand me? Understand." Chloe sat back in her chair, a look of profound, smug satisfaction radiating from her face. She picked up her water goblet and took a slow, deliberate sip. Her dark eyes locked on mine. She was practically glowing with victory. Her father had just publicly humiliated his new wife to defend her terrible behavior. She felt entirely untouchable. In her mind, she was the absolute princess of this castle, and I was just the temporary help who had stepped out of line. She shot a triumphant glance at Brad, who gave her a subtle approving nod. My mother Valerie was practically trembling in her seat, terrified that Marcus's wrath would somehow spill over and jeopardize the financial perks and social bragging rights she was currently enjoying. She mouthed the word sorry at Marcus apologizing on my behalf completely, throwing her own daughter under the bus to protect her proximity to his perceived wealth. I looked at Marcus and his red, angry face. I looked at his finger still pointing at me like a weapon. He was so incredibly arrogant, so completely blinded by his own toxic ego. He genuinely believed his own lies. He actually believed that he was the sole provider, the powerful patriarch who held my entire future in his hands. The sheer irony of his words was so thick, so utterly delicious, that I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud right then and there. "This is my house. This is my money. These are my rules." The words echoed in my mind over and over again. If only he knew the absolute devastating truth about the ground he was currently standing on. He thought he was intimidating me. He thought his aggressive posturing was putting me in my place, but all he was doing was giving me the final necessary confirmation that I owed this man absolutely nothing. I owed this toxic family absolutely nothing. Every single ounce of guilt or hesitation I might have felt about destroying his life completely evaporated in that very moment. I looked at the spilled wine soaking into the tablecloth, a dark, spreading stain that perfectly mirrored the toxicity bleeding out of my marriage and my family. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I met Marcus's furious gaze with a stare so calm, so devoid of fear, that I saw a brief, confused flickering in his eyes. He expected tears. He expected me to bow my head and whisper a frantic apology to him and his daughter. He expected me to shrink down into the helpless, dependent woman he thought he had married. Instead, I simply nodded my head once, very slowly. "I understand you perfectly, Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying clearly through the silent, tension-filled room. "You have made your position incredibly clear." I pushed my chair back, letting it scrape softly against the hardwood floor. I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy blue dress, maintaining a posture so perfectly straight and unbothered that it seemed to unnerve them all. I did not look at my mother, who was staring at her lap in shame. I did not look at Maya or Brad. I did not even look at Chloe, who was still smirking. I turned my back on all of them and walked out of the dining room, leaving the heavy, oppressive silence behind me. Every step I took toward the grand staircase was a step toward their absolute ruin. The silence in the dining room was heavy and almost suffocating, broken only by the sound of Chloe tapping her designer acrylic nails against the polished mahogany table. I sat there perfectly still, absorbing the sheer audacity of my husband's outburst. But before the echo of Marcus's aggressive threats could even fade from the large room, Brad decided it was his perfect moment to shine. Brad was my younger sister Maya's husband. He was a 35-year-old white man who had managed to fail his way into a junior sales director position at Marcus's brokerage firm solely because he was willing to be a full-time sycophant. He saw Marcus's explosive anger not as a red flag or a display of domestic abuse, but as a corporate ladder he could eagerly climb. With a sickeningly bright smile plastered across his face, Brad reached across the table and grabbed the open bottle of expensive Cabernet. He leaned over his suit jacket, straining against his shoulders, and carefully poured another glass for Marcus, acting like a dedicated servant catering to a fragile king. "Come on, Marcus," Brad said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy and a deeply condescending smirk. He shot a patronizing glance in my direction, making sure I caught the full weight of his disrespect. "You know where she came from. You cannot expect a woman with her background to just magically understand the rules of high society overnight. She grew up clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores. It takes time for people like her to learn how to exist in a house like this. You just have to be patient while she catches up to our level." The sheer nerve of his words was staggering. Brad was a man who brought absolutely nothing to the table, neither intellectually nor financially. He drove a leased vehicle he could barely afford and relied entirely on the oversized commission checks Marcus threw his way just to keep up appearances. Yet here he was, sitting at a formal dinner I had cooked in a mansion he could never dream of owning, weaponizing my working-class upbringing to stroke his boss's massive ego. He was actively mocking the very struggles my family had endured to survive, and he was doing it right in front of them to secure his own financial safety at work. Marcus took the refilled wine glass from Brad and offered a slow, appreciative nod, his chest puffed out, visibly inflated by Brad's public flattery. Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh, delighted that another adult in the room was validating her cruelty. She looked at Brad like he was her new favorite court jester, entirely thrilled that her stepmother was being degraded from all sides. But the most devastating blow did not come from my arrogant husband, his spoiled daughter, or my pathetic brother-in-law. The true soul-crushing betrayal came from the woman sitting directly to my left, my biological mother, Valerie. I turned my head slightly, expecting to see at least a flicker of maternal outrage on Valerie's face. I expected her to defend her own flesh and blood against a room full of people treating me like a second-class citizen. Instead, I saw sheer panic. Valerie was a woman entirely consumed by the pursuit of elite social standing within the Black community of Atlanta. She lived for the moment she could casually drop Marcus's name at church luncheons, or brag to her friends about the luxury vacations he supposedly funded. To her, my marriage was not a union of love. It was a golden ticket, and she was terrified that my refusal to bow my head would cause Marcus to snatch that ticket away. Suddenly, Valerie's hand darted out beneath the cover of the heavy lace tablecloth. Her manicured fingers clamped down hard on my forearm. Her grip was tight, desperate, and surprisingly painful. Her acrylic nails dug sharply through the fabric of my navy blue dress and into my skin. I looked at her, genuinely shocked by the physical aggression. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. She leaned in close to me, the scent of her heavy floral perfume masking the absolute stench of her betrayal. "Apologize to her right now, Valerie," hissed through gritted teeth, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with pure venom. She gave my arm another harsh, bruising squeeze, trying to physically force me into submission. "Do you have any idea what you are doing? Swallow your pride and apologize to Chloe? Do you want Marcus to get angry and cut off your sister's funding? Do you want him to stop paying for Maya's lifestyle? You are going to ruin everything for this family just because you cannot keep your mouth shut." I stared at my mother, the harsh words echoing in my mind over and over again. She was demanding that I apologize to a teenager who had just insulted me in my own home. She was demanding that I accept verbal abuse from a man who treated me like an unwanted piece of property. And she was doing it entirely because she wanted to protect the financial handouts Marcus provided to her favorite daughter, Maya. In Valerie's eyes, my dignity was a completely acceptable price to pay for Maya's comfortable lifestyle. My self-respect was just collateral damage in her relentless, desperate pursuit of proximity to wealth. I slowly shifted my gaze to my sister Maya, who was sitting across the table next to her smirking husband. Maya was 32 years old, perfectly styled, and completely silent. She refused to make eye contact with me. She stared intently at her crystal water glass, pretending she did not hear our mother viciously pressuring me to fall on my sword for her financial benefit. Maya knew exactly what Marcus was doing. She knew Brad was out of line. She knew Chloe was being an absolute monster, but she chose her least luxury SUV and her designer handbags over her own sister's well-being. She chose the money. The clarity of that moment was absolute and deeply chilling. I was completely surrounded by parasites. Marcus and Chloe fed on my domestic labor and my expected submissiveness to feel powerful. Brad fed on Marcus's ego to secure his corporate paycheck. Maya fed on Marcus's generosity to maintain her fake high society lifestyle. And my own mother fed on the illusion of prestige, entirely willing to sacrifice her eldest daughter to keep the charade alive. They were a perfect toxic ecosystem, and they all fundamentally relied on me playing the role of the silent, grateful victim. I looked down at my mother's hand, still gripping my forearm like a vice. The physical pain was real, but it was nothing compared to the cold, hard resolve solidifying in my chest. I did not yank my arm away. I did not cause a scene or raise my voice. I simply reached over with my free hand, my movements incredibly slow and deliberate. I placed my fingers over Valerie's wrist, applied a firm, unyielding pressure, and physically peeled her hand off my arm. I pushed her hand back toward her side of the table, my grip communicating a silent, dangerous warning that made her eyes widen in shock. I looked directly into Valerie's eyes, letting her see the absolute void where my daughterly obedience used to be. I had spent my entire life trying to be the perfect daughter, hoping to finally earn her unconditional love and respect. But looking at her terrified, greedy face, I realized that I could never earn something she did not possess. I owed this woman nothing. I owed my sister nothing. And I certainly owed the arrogant men at this table absolutely nothing. The time for playing the dutiful, accommodating wife and daughter was officially over. The time for dismantling their false realities had officially begun. I shifted my attention from my mother's stunned expression and looked directly across the massive mahogany table at my younger sister. Maya felt the heavy, undeniable weight of my gaze. For a fraction of a second, her dark eyes darted up and met mine. I was looking for a single ounce of sibling solidarity, a tiny flicker of regret, or even just basic human empathy. We had shared a bedroom growing up. We had shared clothes, secrets, and the overwhelming burden of our mother's relentless expectations. But in that dining room, sitting under the glittering crystal chandelier, Maya swallowed hard, blinked rapidly, and deliberately turned her face away. She reached for her crystal wine glass, bringing it to her lips with a slightly trembling hand, choosing to stare blankly at the expensive textured wallpaper rather than look her own sister in the eye. That subtle, cowardly movement spoke far louder than any shout could have. By turning her head away, Maya was silently casting her vote. She was actively agreeing with her husband Brad and his disgusting classist mockery. She was aligning herself with our mother's toxic, desperate social climbing. Most importantly, she was cementing her absolute allegiance to Marcus and his bank account. She was entirely willing to let me be verbally abused and degraded in my own dining room just to ensure her weekend trips on Marcus's boat and the designer gifts he handed out kept flowing without interruption. In that exact moment, the very last remaining thread of familial loyalty I held in my heart snapped cleanly in two. I was completely untethered from them, and it was the most profoundly liberating sensation I had ever experienced in my entire life. I slowly surveyed the rest of the dining room table. Marcus was still standing, his chest puffed out, breathing heavily through his nose like a conquering gladiator who had just vanquished a formidable enemy. He looked so incredibly proud of himself for yelling at a woman who weighed 100 pounds less than him. Chloe sat beside him, radiating a smug, venomous satisfaction. She had a mocking little smirk plastered across her heavily glossed lips, eagerly waiting for the tears to fall. She wanted me to sob. She wanted me to jump up from my chair, cover my face in utter shame, and run away crying like a defeated, broken victim. She wanted the dramatic, satisfying conclusion to the cruel trap she had so carefully set. I did not give her a single tear. I did not give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing even a shadow of fear in my eyes. I did not give my mother the emotional drama she thrived on. Instead, I felt a genuine, deeply amused smile slowly curve the corners of my mouth. It was not a forced, trembling grin to hide my pain. It was a faint, chillingly calm smile of absolute superiority. The expression felt completely foreign on my face in their presence, but it felt entirely right. I watched their reactions shift in real time as they registered my smile. Chloe's arrogant smirk faltered slightly, her brow furrowing in deep, teenage confusion. Brad stopped his sycophantic chuckling, his wineglass hovering awkwardly near his mouth. Marcus narrowed his eyes, clearly unsettled by the fact that his aggressive shouting and physical intimidation had not reduced me to a cowering mess. My complete lack of emotional distress was the one response they had never planned for. I sat there radiating a serene, untouchable peace that completely neutralized the toxic, heavy energy they were trying to drown me in. I reached down and picked up my pristine white linen napkin. I folded it with meticulous, unhurried care, making absolutely sure the edges aligned perfectly, and placed it neatly beside my untouched porcelain plate. The fabric made a soft brushing sound against the polished wood, a stark, elegant contrast to the heavy, violent slam of Marcus's hand moments earlier. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed my chair back. It scraped softly against the imported hardwood floor. I stood up to my full height. I smoothed the front of my simple navy blue dress, brushing away an imaginary speck of dust with the utmost grace. I looked directly at Marcus, locking my eyes onto his furious gaze. "You are absolutely right, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth melodic, and completely devoid of any anger or hurt. "This is your reality, and I am just experiencing it. I will leave you and your daughter to enjoy the rest of your evening. Please excuse me." I did not wait for a response. I did not wait for him to process my words or grant me permission to leave his exalted presence. I simply turned my back on the entire table. I walked out of the formal dining room, my posture impeccably straight. I held my head high, my shoulders pulled back, radiating an aura of total, unshakable confidence. I could feel the collective weight of their shocked stares burning into my spine, but I did not look back. Not even for a fraction of a second. The camera of my mind followed my every step from behind as I moved through the grand arching doorway and into the massive foyer. My low heels clicked rhythmically against the imported marble tiles, echoing through the cavernous, softly lit space. The sound was steady and remarkably precise, like the ticking of a countdown clock marking the end of their lavish lifestyle. There was zero trembling in my hands. There was absolutely no weakness in my stride. I moved with the fluid, deliberate grace of a predator silently circling its prey. As I approached the grand, sweeping staircase that led to the second floor, I heard Brad making another terrible, muffled joke at my expense, desperately trying to break the heavy silence I had left in my wake. This was immediately followed by Marcus's loud, booming, artificial laughter. They were attempting to quickly repair the awkward tension, trying to reassure themselves that I was just running away to sulk in my bedroom like a chastised child. Let them laugh, I thought to myself, placing my hand on the cool, ornate iron railing. Let them enjoy their expensive vintage wine and their pathetic delusions of grandeur. I climbed the stairs with measured, perfectly even steps. With every stair I ascended, I mentally detached myself further from the role of the submissive, accommodating wife. I traced my fingers along the expensive, textured wallpaper that Marcus had bragged about importing directly from Europe. He loved this house. He loved the illusion of massive power it gave him. He loved parading his wealthy clients and frat brothers through these wide halls, pointing out the custom architectural details and the expensive modern artwork. He drew his entire identity from this physical structure, firmly believing that owning it made him an untouchable king in Atlanta's elite society. He was painfully unaware that his kingdom was built on sand. He had no idea that the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on this very property 6 months ago because he had completely drained his accounts, making terrible over-leveraged investments. He was even more unaware that my private equity firm had quietly stepped in through a shell corporation and purchased the bad debt directly from the lenders. I was not just walking up the stairs of the house I lived in. I was walking up the stairs of the house I legally owned lock, stock, and barrel. I was walking on my own hardwood floors. I was breathing the air in my own property. I reached the second-floor landing and turned down the long, thickly carpeted hallway toward my private home office. It was a room at the far end of the house, a quiet space Marcus rarely ever entered because he found my financial consulting work incredibly boring and entirely beneath his notice. He had absolutely no idea that behind that heavy oak door I managed global asset portfolios that dwarfed his entire inflated net worth. I reached the door, turned the heavy brass handle, and stepped inside. I closed the door behind me and reached up to turn the heavy deadbolt. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying, highly definitive thud. The thick walls instantly muffled the faint sounds of arrogant laughter still drifting up from the dining room below. I was completely alone, perfectly safe, and entirely in control within my own fortress. I walked over to my heavy mahogany desk and turned on the small brass reading lamp. The warm light washed over my dual computer monitors and illuminated the sleek digital keypad of the hidden safe built seamlessly into the wall paneling. The time for smiling politely through sheer disrespect was officially over. The time for silent, absolute destruction had arrived. I reached toward the polished wood paneling of my office wall and slid back the concealed cover. The cool metal of the digital keypad met my fingertips. I punched in the 6-digit passcode, a sequence known only to me. The heavy steel door of the hidden safe clicked open with a soft mechanical hum, revealing the dark interior. Inside lay the physical proof of my entire existence. The contrast between this quiet, secure space and the toxic dining room downstairs was staggering. Down there, Marcus was busy playing the role of a wealthy king holding court for an audience of sycophants. Up here, I was holding the actual keys to the kingdom. I reached past the stacks of encrypted hard drives and leather-bound corporate ledgers, pulling out a thick manila folder. I carried it over to my mahogany desk and laid it flat under the warm amber glow of the brass reading lamp. I opened the heavy cover. Inside sat a stack of premium bond paper bound together with a dark blue legal clip. It was our prenuptial agreement. I stared down at the final page where Marcus had scrawled his name in bold, aggressive strokes. His signature took up half the page, a perfect representation of his inflated, desperate ego. Next to it was my own signature, neat, unassuming, and incredibly dangerous. Looking at that dark blue ink transported me straight back to the humid Tuesday afternoon we signed it. It was exactly 1 month before our wedding day. Marcus had summoned me to his downtown office suite to meet with his high-priced corporate attorney. I remember walking into that sprawling glass-walled conference room and feeling the sheer condescension radiating from both men. The room smelled of expensive leather and stale espresso. Marcus sat at the head of a massive glass table, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, checking his heavy platinum watch. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and absolute dominance. He slid this exact document across the smooth glass surface toward me, pushing a heavy gold-plated pen into my hand. "I need you to sign this, Naomi," he had said, using his smooth, commanding investor voice, the one he reserved for closing deals and intimidating subordinates. It is standard operating procedure for men in my tax bracket. We have to protect our assets. You understand, do you not? I am building generational wealth, and I cannot risk losing half of my empire if things do not work out between us." He leaned across the glass table, looking at me as if I were a naive, uneducated child who needed the harsh realities of the financial world explained to her slowly. "What is mine," he stated, enunciating every single syllable, so I would not dare miss his point. "And if you ever walk out that door, you leave empty-handed. I will not have my hard-earned money drained by a ridiculous divorce settlement. I built my life from the ground up, and I protect what belongs to me." His attorney, an older white man with a severe haircut, sat there with a smug, satisfied smile. He was clearly accustomed to intimidating much younger women into signing away their legal rights. They both sat back and watched me, fully believing they held all the power in the room. Marcus had run a rudimentary background check on me before he proposed. He had his accountant pull my basic tax returns and saw exactly what I deliberately wanted him to see. He saw a woman registered as an independent financial consultant, reporting a modest annual salary of $70,000. To a man who routinely boasted about closing million-dollar deals at the country club, my reported income was nothing but pocket change. It was a cute little hobby in his eyes. He genuinely believed I was marrying him to secure a comfortable lifestyle, to upgrade from my working-class background to his glittering world of luxury cars and designer labels. He thought my $70,000 salary meant I was desperate for his financial rescue. He wanted a wife who would be entirely financially dependent on him. A woman who would tolerate his blatant disrespect, his late nights, and his spoiled daughter's cruelty because she simply could not afford to pack up and leave. That prenuptial agreement was his ultimate weapon of domestic control. He designed it to be completely ruthless and entirely one-sided. He ensured that any property acquired before or during the marriage remained the sole exclusive possession of the person whose name was on the deed. He explicitly waived all rights to spousal support for both parties. He made absolutely sure that our finances would remain permanently separated by an impenetrable legal wall. He wanted to guarantee that if he ever got tired of me, he could throw me out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. I remember picking up that heavy gold-plated pen and looking directly into his arrogant dark eyes. I did not argue with a single clause. I did not ask for legal revisions. I did not demand a fair share of the marital assets or beg for a safety net. I simply smiled. A soft, compliant smile nodded my head and signed my name on the dotted line exactly as he commanded. I watched his chest physically puff out with pride as I handed the document back to his lawyer. Marcus thought my swift compliance was a sign of total submission. He thought I was terrified of losing him and willing to accept his draconian terms just to secure my status as the wife of a wealthy broker. He thought he had successfully bullied me into submission. He had absolutely no idea that by forcing me to sign that ironclad contract, he was handing me the greatest gift I could ever possibly receive. I ran my fingers over the crisp pages of the document now sitting on my desk in the quiet of my home office. The sheer breathtaking irony of this contract was an absolute masterpiece. Marcus had paid a top-tier legal team tens of thousands of dollars to draft a document so viciously restrictive that it offered zero financial mercy. He built a massive legal fortress to lock me out of his supposed empire, but in doing so, he completely locked himself out of mine. Every single cruel clause he insisted upon to leave me destitute was now the exact legal mechanism protecting my massive fortune from his greedy hands. The waiver of spousal support meant he could never touch a single dime of my money when I finally threw him to the curb. The strict separation of assets meant my private equity firm, my offshore accounts, and my extensive real estate portfolio were completely invisible and completely untouchable to him. He was so incredibly eager to protect his fragile ego and his heavily leveraged bank accounts that he failed to look past the surface. He saw a black woman from a modest neighborhood and made a fatal, catastrophic assumption. He assumed my $70,000 salary was the absolute ceiling of my potential. He never bothered to dig deeper. If he had hired a real investigator instead of a cheap accountant, he might have discovered that the modest consulting firm I registered was merely a front. It was a tiny subsidiary corporation created solely to manage my personal daily expenses and keep my name out of the public eye. He never realized that the real money, the hundreds of millions of dollars I controlled, was safely secured under layers of anonymous holding companies and corporate trusts. I closed the heavy manila folder and tapped it twice against the smooth surface of my desk. The sound was sharp, final, and deeply satisfying. Marcus had spent the last 6 months treating me like a subservient guest in his home, holding this very contract over my head as a silent daily threat. He used it to enable Chloe's toxic behavior, allowing her to humiliate me at the dinner table because he knew I supposedly had nowhere else to go. He believed he had trapped me in a beautiful gilded cage. He thought he possessed all the power, but the cage was his all along and the lock was about to snap shut. I smiled as I turned the crisp pages of the prenuptial agreement. It was a genuine, deep smile of absolute vindication. Marcus had hired a ruthless attorney to draft clauses that waived all rights to my businesses, current and future. He had defined separate property with such aggressive, watertight legal jargon that his lawyer must have patted himself on the back for weeks. Every single paragraph was designed to ensure I could never touch his money. But that same watertight language was exactly what now shielded my massive wealth from his desperate, grasping hands. What Marcus did not know, and what my mother and sister could never comprehend, is that I am not just a mid-level financial consultant. I am the hidden majority shareholder and founder of Vanguard Apex. We are a private equity firm that manages commercial acquisitions, distressed debt, and high-yield corporate portfolios across 3 continents. My personal net worth crossed into the tens of millions 3 years ago, and it has only continued to grow. I built my empire quietly in the shadows. I did not buy flashy imported cars or post my balance sheets on social media. I did not flaunt designer labels or demand VIP tables at exclusive restaurants. In the world of real wealth, stealth is your absolute greatest asset. I kept my lifestyle deliberately modest, driving a reliable sedan and living well below my means because I wanted to find genuine love. I wanted a partner who valued my mind, my character, and my ambition, not my investment portfolio. I kept my wealth a secret from my mother because I knew she would instantly exploit it to buy her way into the elite church circles she worshipped. I hid it from Maya because she would have demanded I fund her superficial lifestyle. And I kept it from Marcus because I wanted to see who he truly was behind closed doors. The man who revealed himself to me was a monster. Marcus represents a very specific breed of corporate men who believe that wearing a platinum Rolex and dropping thousands of dollars on a single dinner makes them invincible. He is obsessed with the aesthetic of wealth rather than the actual foundation of it. He thrives on projecting an image of untouchable black excellence to our social circle. But behind the custom Italian suits, the country club memberships, and the arrogant posturing Marcus is an empty shell. He is a financial ghost, desperately trying to haunt a life he can no longer afford. While he was busy showing off at charity galas and berating me for buying off-brand dresses, his actual brokerage firm was hemorrhaging money at a catastrophic rate. Marcus is addicted to high-risk margin trading and over-leveraged commercial real estate investments. He gambled heavily on risky developments just before the market took a massive downturn. His lenders called in their margins months ago. His credit is entirely maxed out across multiple hidden accounts. He has been quietly shuffling money around from one failing account to another just to keep the lights on and the leased sports cars in the driveway. He is drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, and he has been masking his intense financial panic with domestic aggression. He treated me like a subservient peasant because he desperately needed someone to look down on. He needed me to be poor and dependent so he could feel like a powerful man as his own financial reality crumbled around him. He allowed his spoiled daughter Chloe to mock me because indulging her delusions of grandeur was much easier than sitting her down and admitting to her that her college trust fund is completely gone. He let her buy designer handbags and host lavish parties because maintaining the illusion of unlimited wealth is the only thing keeping his fragile ego from shattering into a million pieces. And then there is the crown jewel of his pathetic facade, the 10,000-square-foot mansion we are currently sitting in. The ultra-luxury home where he just stood at the head of the dining table, puffed out his chest and screamed that it was his house and his rules. The absolute devastating truth is that Marcus has not owned this house for half a year. Because of his massive loan defaults, The bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings exactly 6 months ago. He has been frantically hiding the final notices, intercepting the mail, and dodging aggressive calls from collection agencies. He has not paid the property taxes, the mortgage, or the exorbitant homeowners association fees in almost a year. He has been playing the role of the wealthy patriarch while literally standing on the edge of a financial cliff. He thinks he is a king, but he is just a squatter in a tailored suit, waiting for the inevitable eviction. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk and let out a soft laugh. The sheer irony of his dining room speech was almost too delicious to bear. He had pointed his finger at my face and told me I was just a guest in his home. He threatened to pack my cheap bags and throw me out onto the street. He had no idea that the bank had grown tired of his empty promises and put the debt up for sale to institutional buyers. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet, the crystal chandeliers he bragged about, and the very roof over his head no longer belonged to him or his creditors. They were sitting downstairs right now drinking wine they bought on a maxed-out credit card, laughing at my expense, and patting themselves on the back for putting me in my place. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that their luxurious world was already dead and buried. Marcus had spent months looking right past me, assuming my silence was a sign of weakness. He assumed my patience was submission. He never once stopped to consider that the quiet woman he was relentlessly pushing into a corner was the same woman who had the capital, the resources, and the sheer willpower to buy his entire life out from under him. I carefully placed the prenuptial agreement back into the manila folder. I traced my hand over the dark blue legal clip securing my financial freedom. Marcus had demanded this to ensure I would leave this marriage with absolutely nothing. He had succeeded in writing the most ruthless separation agreement his lawyers could construct. But the only person walking away from this marriage with nothing would be him. I pushed the heavy manila folder to the edge of my mahogany desk and turned my attention to the dual curved monitors sleeping silently in the dark. I tapped the spacebar. The screens instantly flared to life, bathing the room in a sharp, cool blue light that cut through the warm amber shadows of the office. I placed my finger on the biometric scanner hidden beneath the edge of the desk. A tiny green light flashed, reading my fingerprint, and the heavy encryption software guarding my workstation seamlessly unlocked. I opened the secure private portal for Vanguard Apex. The dashboard loaded immediately, displaying a complex but beautifully organized array of global assets, offshore accounts, and corporate acquisitions. To anyone else, it would look like an overwhelming wall of data and fluctuating numbers. To me, it was the digital heartbeat of the empire I had built from the ground up. I bypassed the international portfolios and navigated directly to our domestic real estate division, specifically clicking into a subsidiary holding company named Onyx Capital Solutions. Onyx Capital Solutions was a ghost entity. It was a perfectly legal, highly insulated shell corporation I had created years ago to handle aggressive acquisitions of distressed properties without ever attaching my name to the transactions. It was the perfect vehicle for moving quietly through the cutthroat world of high-stakes real estate. I typed in a specific search query, pulling up the internal file labeled with the exact street address of the sprawling 10,000-square-foot mansion I was currently sitting inside. The file opened, filling my right monitor with a comprehensive of Marcus and his catastrophic financial failures. It was all right there in stark, undeniable high definition. The screen displayed the original mortgage documents from 5 years ago, followed by a desperate series of second and third mortgages he had taken out to fund his increasingly lavish lifestyle. It showed the catastrophic margin calls from his brokerages and the devastating losses he had suffered in commercial real estate gambles. And finally, it displayed the formal notice of default issued by his primary bank exactly 6 months ago. Marcus had been drowning in a sea of toxic debt, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of his high society status, when his bank finally ran out of patience and initiated the foreclosure process to seize the mansion. He had panicked. He had scrambled to find a private hard money lender willing to bail him out and keep the eviction off his public record. He thought he had found a miracle when Onyx Capital Solutions stepped in. 3 months ago, I had authorized my portfolio managers at Onyx to purchase his bad debt directly from the bank. We bought the distressed loan at a steep discount, paying pennies on the dollar to take the toxic asset off the bank's hands. The bank was absolutely thrilled to be rid of Marcus and his empty promises. Marcus, meanwhile, was completely oblivious to the change in ownership. He was instructed to direct his exorbitant monthly payments to a new holding company via a blind trust operating out of Delaware. I scrolled down the screen, pulling up the payment ledger. My eyes scanned the digital transaction records, watching the satisfying flow of capital. For the past 90 days, Marcus had been frantically scraping together every last dollar he could siphon from his failing brokerage firm to meet the crushing monthly payments. He genuinely believed he had simply refinanced with a strict but private lender. He thought he was buying himself more time to recover his losses and keep up his wealthy facade. He had absolutely no idea that he was now writing monthly checks to a company entirely controlled by his own wife. Every single payment he had made for the past 3 months had gone straight into the corporate coffers of Vanguard Apex. He was literally paying rent to live in the very house he was currently using to assert his dominance over me. The irony was so sharp and so deeply intoxicating that it sent a thrill of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. He had stood in that dining room, puffed out his chest, and declared that it was his house and his money. But the digital ledger glowing brightly on my monitor told the absolute indisputable truth. The house belonged to me. The ground he was standing on belonged to me. Even the roof over his arrogant head belonged to me. I moved my mouse over to the execution panel on the right side of the screen. The final step was to initiate the formal asset recovery protocol. As the legal owner of the debt and the property, Onyx Capital Solutions had the right to call in the full amount of the loan immediately upon any breach of the forbearance agreement. Furthermore, because Marcus had actually signed over the deed in lieu of foreclosure to avoid public bankruptcy, he was technically operating under a strict occupancy lease, a lease that I had designed to be incredibly unforgiving. I opened the digital legal file containing his eviction notice. My attorneys had drafted it weeks ago, keeping it on standby for the exact moment I decided to drop the hammer. I reviewed the document, ensuring every legal mechanism was perfectly in place. The notice cited his ongoing financial instability, the depletion of his required escrow accounts, and a specific clause regarding the maintenance of a peaceful residential environment. A clause he had thoroughly violated by allowing his daughter to host wild, destructive parties and by creating a hostile living situation. I hovered the cursor over the bright red transfer command button. This was the point of no return. Once I clicked this button, the automated system would immediately dispatch the finalized legal paperwork to my lead attorney in Atlanta. It would authorize them to coordinate directly with the local sheriff department for an immediate expedited eviction. The legal machinery I had carefully and quietly assembled over the past 3 months was primed and ready to bear down on Marcus with an unstoppable, crushing force. I paused for just a moment, listening to the sounds of the house. Through the thick oak door of my office, I could faintly hear the muffled sounds of music and laughter drifting up from the first floor. The dinner party had apparently transitioned into a celebration of my supposed defeat. My family, the people who had cowardly stood by and watched me be humiliated, were likely exchanging hushed, awkward goodbyes, eager to escape the toxic atmosphere they had actively helped create. Marcus and Chloe were undoubtedly reveling in their perceived victory, convinced they had successfully broken my spirit and put the poor financial advisor firmly back in her place. They had absolutely no idea that their entire reality was about to be fundamentally altered by a single click of a mouse. The luxurious life they clung to with such desperate, pathetic entitlement was already over. The mansion, the status, the glittering illusion of generational wealth, it was all entirely gone. I had systematically dismantled the very foundation of Marcus and his arrogant existence. And I had done it without raising my voice, without throwing a tantrum, and without shedding a single tear. I had used his own greed, his own financial recklessness, and his own blinding ego completely against him. I pressed down on the mouse, clicking the transfer command button. A confirmation prompt appeared instantly on the center of the screen, asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed with the asset recovery and eviction protocol. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I confirmed the action. The system processed the request, the progress bar filling rapidly with a bright green light. Within moments, an automated alert flashed across the top of the monitor, confirming that the legal dispatch had been successfully routed to my attorney. The wheels were officially in motion. By tomorrow morning, the reality of his situation would crash down on him like a ton of bricks. I leaned back in my heavy leather desk chair, staring at the glowing confirmation screen. The adrenaline that had been humming beneath my skin slowly subsided, replaced by a profound, icy calm. I had spent my entire life being underestimated by the people closest to me. My mother had seen me as a tool for social climbing. My sister had viewed me as convenient competition to elevate herself. And my husband had treated me as a decorative accessory that he could verbally abuse whenever he needed an ego boost. They had all looked at me and seen someone weak, someone manageable, someone who would just take the abuse and ask for more. They were about to learn the most devastating lesson of their lives. True power does not need to scream its presence from the head of a formal dining table. True power operates in the absolute quiet of the shadows, meticulously calculating every single move and anticipating every possible weakness. It waits patiently for the precise moment to strike. And when it finally does, the destruction is absolute and irreversible. I stood up from my desk, my resolve hardening like tempered steel. The night was far from over, and the morning would bring a brutal reckoning they could never have possibly imagined. The morning sun barely managed to pierce the heavy velvet curtains of my office when the door handle turned. It was just past 7 a.m., but I had been awake for hours methodically reviewing the final stages of the asset recovery protocol. I didn't bother turning around from my monitors. As the door swung open, the heavy wood scraping against the imported rug, Marcus stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing, radiating the kind of toxic entitled energy that had suffocated me for the past 6 months. He didn't knock. He didn't offer a morning greeting. He simply strode into the room, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. In his right hand, he held a thick manila envelope, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. The arrogance rolling off him was palpable, a physical force meant to intimidate. He had spent the entire night stewing in his own perceived victory, convinced that his explosive display at the dinner table had firmly established his dominance. Now, he was here to deliver the final crushing blow. He stopped just a few feet from my desk, towering over me. For a deliberate moment, he simply stared, letting the silence stretch out, waiting for me to shrink under his gaze. When I didn't flinch, didn't offer a frantic apology, or beg for his forgiveness, his jaw tightened. The faint, triumphant smirk that had been playing on his lips hardened into a cruel, unforgiving line. "You really don't get it, do you, Naomi?" He started, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "You actually think you can sit at my table, disrespect my daughter, and then hide away in this pathetic little office like nothing happened? You think your silence is some kind of power move? It's not. It's just pathetic." I slowly pivoted my chair to face him, leaning back slightly, my hands steepled into my lap. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, offering him absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, no submission. The contrast between his volatile, aggressive energy and my total, unshakable calm clearly infuriated him. He wanted a reaction. He needed a reaction to validate his fragile ego. And my refusal to give him one was driving him absolutely insane. "You are the most ungrateful woman I have ever met." He continued, his voice rising, the carefully constructed veneer of the sophisticated investor cracking to reveal the insecure tyrant beneath. "I pulled you out of your mediocre life. I gave you access to a world you could never have dreamed of. I put a roof over your head that costs more than you'll make in a lifetime. And how do you repay me? By acting like you're somehow superior to my flesh and blood, by embarrassing me in front of your own trailer park family." He took a step closer, leaning over my desk, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne, sharp and overpowering, filled the space between us. "I'm done playing this game with you, Naomi. I'm done pretending that you are anything more than a massive disappointment. You wanted to act like you don't need me. Fine. Let's see how well you survive out there in the real world when I'm not footing the bill. With a sudden, violent motion, he slammed the thick manila envelope down onto my desk. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room, a harsh punctuation mark to his tirade. The flap of the envelope was unsealed, and a thick stack of legal documents slid partially out. The stark black text glaring against the pristine white paper. "Divorce papers," he announced, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. "My lawyers drew them up first thing this morning. They're standard. They're non-negotiable. And they enforce every single clause of that prenuptial agreement you were so eager to sign. You walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Absolutely nothing." He stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for the devastating reality of his words to sink in. He wanted to see the panic in my eyes. He wanted to see me realize that my comfortable, luxurious life was over, that I was being thrown back into the working-class struggles he so deeply despised. He fully expected me to break down, to plead with him, to reconsider, to promise I would change and learn my place. I glanced down at the documents, then slowly back up at him. I didn't reach for the papers. I didn't even blink. "You have exactly 3 days," he stated, his tone flat and unyielding, delivering his final ultimatum. 3 days to pack up your cheap off-brand clothes and get the hell out of my house. I want you gone before the weekend. If you're still here on Monday morning, I will personally have security drag you out to the curb. Do not test me on this, Naomi. I am not playing games." He turned on his heel, his expensive shoes clicking sharply as he marched toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for a response. He was entirely convinced that he had just delivered a fatal, crushing blow, that he had successfully destroyed my life and reasserted his absolute control. He believed he was the undisputed king of his castle, banishing an unruly subject. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the silent room. I sat there for a long moment, the quiet settling back over my office. I looked down at the divorce papers resting on my desk, right next to the keyboard that controlled a financial empire he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He wanted a divorce. He wanted me out of his house in 3 days. He was incredibly eager to enforce the prenuptial agreement, completely unaware that those very documents were the exact legal mechanism sealing his own absolute ruin. The sheer, breathtaking irony of his arrogant ultimatum was almost too perfect. He had just handed me the final necessary piece of ammunition I needed to completely dismantle his life, and he had done it with a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face. He thought he was giving me 3 days to pack. I knew I only needed 2 hours. The heavy oak door of my office had barely been closed for an hour when the deep, vibrating thud of heavy bass began to rattle the floorboards beneath my feet. It was barely noon on a Saturday, yet the unmistakable sound of a massive, unchaperoned house party was erupting from the first floor. I left the divorce papers sitting exactly where Marcus had slammed them down and walked out into the hallway. As I descended the grand sweeping staircase, the sheer scale of the disrespect came into full view. Chloe had wasted absolutely no time celebrating my supposedly imminent departure. She had invited over a dozen of her wealthy, entitled friends to the house. They were sprawled across the custom white Italian leather sofas, their dirty designer sneakers resting casually on the delicate glass coffee tables. Red plastic cups and half-empty bottles of expensive liquor that Marcus hoarded in his locked wine cellar were scattered across the imported marble countertops of the kitchen. These were the children of Atlanta's elite, raised in gated communities and taught that consequences were only for people who could not afford to buy their way out of them. They were spilling dark liquids on the pristine rugs, carelessly knocking over expensive decorative vases, and treating the 10,000-square-foot mansion like a cheap rental hall. The music was deafening, was shaking the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. I paused on the bottom step, my face a mask of absolute calm, simply observing the physical destruction of my own property. Chloe spotted me almost immediately. She was standing by the massive kitchen island, holding a crystal glass filled with something bright pink, surrounded by a group of girls who looked like exact clones of her. When she saw me standing there, her eyes lit up with a vicious, predatory glee. She set her glass down with a sharp clink and marched directly toward me, her entourage eagerly following right behind her, like a pack of wolves sensing blood in the water. She stopped just inches from me, invading my personal space, with the exact same arrogant aggression her father had displayed just hours earlier. Look who finally decided to come out of hiding. Chloe announced, her voice pitched loudly enough to ensure every single person in the massive living room stopped talking and turned to watch the show. Before I could even register her sudden movement, Chloe swung her arm back and forcefully threw her heavy, oversized designer handbag directly at my chest. I did not raise my hands to catch it. I simply shifted my weight slightly to the side and let the heavy leather bag slam past me onto the marble floor with a loud, satisfying thud. The gold hardware scraped harshly against the stone. Chloe's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second at my refusal to play the role of the obedient servant, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Pick that up," she commanded, jutting her chin toward the bag on the floor. "And when you are done with that, there is a spilled drink in the media room that needs to be scrubbed out of the rug." I looked down at the expensive bag, then back up at her, maintaining perfect, unblinking eye contact. "My dad told me the good news," Chloe continued, her voice dripping with venomous joy. "He told me he finally served you with the divorce papers and gave you 3 days to pack your cheap trash and get out of our lives. So since you are officially getting kicked to the curb on Monday, you might as well make yourself useful while you are still breathing our air. Consider it paying off your final debt to us. Clean up after my friends. Act like the maid you were always meant to be." A chorus of cruel, mocking laughter erupted from her friends. They whispered to each other, pointing at my simple, unbranded clothing, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of the supposedly defeated stepmother being put in her place by the triumphant daughter of the house. They genuinely believed they were witnessing my ultimate humiliation. They thought I was standing there in silence because I was completely broken, paralyzed by the reality of my impending poverty and the devastating loss of this luxurious lifestyle. They had absolutely no idea that every spilled drink, every scuff mark on the hardwood floors, and every noise complaint this wild party was inevitably generating from the wealthy neighbors was acting as documented, undeniable proof of a severe lease violation. Chloe was not just throwing a careless party. She was enthusiastically hammering the final legal nails into her own father's coffin. The eviction notice my lawyers were currently finalizing required a solid, immediate justification to bypass standard waiting periods. Chloe was handing me that justification on a silver platter. I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket. Chloe rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. "What are you doing? Are you going to call my dad and cry to him? Go ahead. See if he cares. He is the one who told me I could invite everyone over to celebrate you leaving." I did not call Marcus. I simply opened my camera application, raised my phone, and took a clear, high-definition photograph of the spilled liquor on the marble island, the muddy shoes on the white leather sofa, and the dozen underage teenagers consuming alcohol in the main living area. I took 3 more pictures, calmly rotating my body to capture the full extent of the property damage and the chaotic, unauthorized gathering. "What is wrong with you?" Chloe snapped, stepping forward and reaching aggressively for my phone. "Stop taking pictures of my friends." I smoothly stepped back, slipping the phone safely into my pocket. My voice, when I finally spoke, was so incredibly soft and composed that the entire room had to hold its collective breath to hear me. "I am simply documenting the current state of the property, Chloe," I said, offering her that same chilling, polite smile that had unnerved her father the night before. "It is standard legal procedure when an occupancy lease is about to be forcefully terminated due to gross negligence." Chloe frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows knitting together in deep confusion. "What are you even talking about? You do not have a lease. You are getting evicted by my father. You are literally homeless." I looked around the room at the massive mess they had created, mentally calculating the cost of the professional cleaning crew I would be dispatching here by tomorrow afternoon. I looked back at Chloe, who was standing there in her expensive clothes, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire glittering world was currently in a terrifying freefall. She was so blinded by her own inherited arrogance that she could not recognize the absolute danger standing right in front of her. "Enjoy your party, Chloe," I said, my tone incredibly pleasant, as if I were wishing her well on a holiday. "Make sure you take plenty of pictures with your friends today. You will want to remember this house exactly as it is right now." I did not wait for her confused, angry response. I did not bend down to pick up her discarded designer bag. I simply stepped around it, my posture flawlessly straight, and walked calmly toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of sparkling water. Behind me, I could hear Chloe loudly cursing, commanding one of her friends to pick up her bag, desperately trying to reclaim the dominance she felt slipping through her fingers. Her voice was shrill and panicked, completely stripped of its former smug certainty. She thought she was throwing a massive victory party to celebrate my destruction. She had no idea she was actually hosting a farewell tour for her own ruined life. I poured my sparkling water, watching the tiny bubbles rise and burst against the rim of the crystal glass. When the heavy oak front doors of the mansion swung open again, over the pulsing, deafening bass of Chloe's terrible music, I heard the obnoxiously loud voice of my brother-in-law, Brad. He strode into the grand foyer with my sister Maya trailing right behind him. They navigated through the crowd of intoxicated, privileged teenagers with practiced ease, acting as if they were the glamorous VIP guests of this chaotic daytime club. Brad high-fived one of Chloe's friends, desperate to appear young, wealthy, and relevant, while Maya adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses and smoothed down her expensive silk dress, a piece I knew for a fact she had purchased using a credit card Marcus had paid off just last month. They spotted me standing alone at the massive marble kitchen island. The predatory gleam in Brad's eyes was instantaneous. He nudged Maya, pointing directly in my direction, and the two of them altered their course, marching straight into the kitchen, like a pair of executioners coming to inspect the condemned. Brad leaned heavily against the marble counter, deliberately invading my personal space, with a sickeningly bright smile plastered across his face. He smelled of cheap cologne and unearned confidence. "Well, look who is still hanging around," Brad sneered, crossing his arms over his chest and looking me up and down with absolute contempt. "Marcus told me the good news at the office this morning. He said he finally dropped the divorce papers on your desk and gave you the boot. Honestly, Naomi, I am surprised you have not already packed your bags and caught a Greyhound bus back to whatever tragic working-class neighborhood you crawled out of." I took a slow sip of my water, letting the cold liquid soothe my throat, and simply raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue digging his own grave. He took the bait eagerly, his ego demanding that he grind me down as far as possible to prove his loyalty to his boss. "But hey, I am a generous guy." Brad continued, his voice dripping with thick, heavy condescension. "Since you are going to be out on the street by Monday morning, I actually went ahead and pulled some strings for you. I know a guy who rents out some rundown apartments on the south side of the city. The plumbing is questionable, the linoleum is peeling, and you might have to share the space with a few roaches, but it perfectly suits a woman with your current financial portfolio. It is right on the public bus route, too, so you will not have to worry about begging Marcus to keep that car he leased for you. I can even bring over some heavy-duty black trash bags later tonight so you can pack up those cheap off-brand dresses of yours." I shifted my gaze from his smug face to Maya, waiting to see if my own flesh and blood would sink as low as the man she married. Maya let out a long, dramatic sigh, shaking her head with an expression of profound, entirely fabricated pity. She stepped closer, attempting to place a comforting hand on my shoulder, but I smoothly took a step back, refusing her toxic touch. "Naomi, please do not make this harder than it has to be." Maya said, her voice laced with fake sympathy that made my stomach turn. "Brad is just trying to be realistic. You really messed up this time. Marcus is a powerful, generous man, and you completely humiliated him in front of his own daughter last night. What did you expect was going to happen when you refused to apologize? You forgot your place, and now you are paying the price." She leaned in closer, dropping her voice into a conspiratorial whisper, as if she were imparting some grand, life-saving wisdom that only she possessed. "If you are smart, you will go upstairs right now, get on your knees, and literally beg Marcus for forgiveness. Cry if you have to. Tell him you were completely out of line, that you are incredibly sorry, and that you will do absolutely anything to make it right. If you stroke his ego enough and promise to never speak back to Chloe again, he might just tear up those divorce papers and let you stay. It is better to swallow your pride and live in a mansion than to be stubborn and end up homeless. You have to learn how to play the game, Naomi." I stood there looking back and forth between the two of them. It was a breathtaking display of pure, unfiltered parasitism. Brad was a mediocre salesman who relied entirely on Marcus's nepotism to keep his job blindly loyal to a boss who was actively going bankrupt. Maya was a woman who had eagerly traded her own sister's dignity for the privilege of carrying a branded handbag and attending country club dinners she could not actually afford. They were lecturing me about survival, completely unaware that they had hitched their entire wagon to a rapidly sinking ship. They thought they were giving me a brutal reality check. They did not know they were standing on the deck of the Titanic mocking someone who was securely sitting in the only lifeboat. The absolute irony of Brad's insults was almost too delicious to bear. He was standing in a foreclosed home mocking my financial status while working for a brokerage firm that I was currently in the process of dismantling. He had no idea that my private equity fund had finalized the acquisition of Marcus's failing just 48 hours ago. Brad was literally insulting the hidden CEO of the corporation that now owned his employment contract. He thought he was untouchable because he hid behind Marcus, but Marcus was already a ghost in the financial world. "I appreciate your deep concern for my future living arrangements, Brad," I said, my voice smooth as silk, completely unruffled by his cruel insults. "But I assure you my housing situation is entirely secure. You, however, might want to hold on to the contact information for that landlord on the south side. Something tells me you are going to need a very cheap place to live much sooner than you think." Brad let out a loud barking laugh, shaking his head at what he perceived to be my pathetic delusion. "Right. Sure thing, Naomi. Keep telling yourself that. Denial is a perfectly normal stage of grief when you realize you just fumbled the biggest bag of your entire life. You thought you were too good for Marcus, and now you are going to be scrubbing floors to pay rent." Maya rolled her eyes, crossing her arms defensively. "We are trying to help you, Naomi, and you are just being arrogant and bitter as usual. Do not come crying to us on Monday when Marcus literally throws you out on the pavement. We will not be bailing you out or letting you crash on our couch. You brought this entirely on yourself." "I would never dream of asking either of you for a single dime," I replied, maintaining that chilling, perfectly polite smile that I knew unsettled them. "Because by Monday morning, neither of you will have a dime to your names. Enjoy the party, Maya. Drink up, Brad. It is going to be a very long, very cold week for both of you." I turned my back on their confused, mocking faces and walked calmly out of the kitchen. I navigated back through the chaotic living room, ignoring the loud music and the entitled teenagers trashing the property. I had packing to do, but not the kind they imagined. I needed to gather my personal documents, my encrypted hard drives, and a few sentimental items before the heavy artillery arrived. The clock was ticking. The legal machinery was in relentless motion, and the explosive finale of their glittering fake lives was rapidly approaching. I reached the top of the grand staircase, leaving the thumping bass of the teenage party behind me on the first floor. But I was not alone. The sound of heavy footsteps and whispering voices trailed closely behind me. Chloe, Brad, and Maya had followed me upstairs like a pack of hungry hyenas, eager to witness a kill. They were absolutely determined to watch my supposed downfall in real time, thirsty for the drama they believed would break me. I walked down the thickly carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy oak door to my private office. I expected to find the room empty exactly as I had left it. Instead, Marcus was standing directly behind my mahogany desk. He had let himself in, invading my sanctuary with the same arrogant entitlement he applied to every other aspect of his life. He stood there with his arms crossed over his custom-tailored suit, a look of profound, toxic triumph plastered across his face. The thick manila envelope containing the divorce papers rested right in the center of my desk, a stark white warning flag demanding my immediate attention. Chloe pushed past me into the office, leaning casually against the doorframe with her arms crossed, her designer handbag dangling from her wrist. Brad and Maya crowded in right behind her, blocking my only exit. I was completely surrounded in my own workspace. This was Marcus orchestrating a deliberate, calculated ambush. He wanted an audience. He needed his daughter and his sycophants to watch him assert his dominance, to witness him officially discarding the woman who had dared to look him in the eye and refused to bow. "Are you ready to stop playing games now, Naomi?" Marcus asked, his voice low and dripping with condescension. He gestured toward the legal documents resting on the polished wood. "I told you I wanted you out in 3 days, but seeing as you have decided to wander around my house with that ridiculous, arrogant attitude, I have changed my mind. You are going to sign these papers right now in front of everyone, and then you are going to pack a single bag and leave my property before the sun goes down." Brad let out a low whistle, shaking his head with a fake, exaggerated wince. Ouch. That is rough, Naomi. But hey, you brought this on yourself. You poke the bear, you get the teeth. I can still call that landlord on the south side for you if you need a place to crash tonight. Maya let out another one of her heavily manufactured sighs, stepping forward to play the role of the concerned but deeply disappointed sister. Just sign them, Naomi, she pleaded, her voice laced with fake sympathy. Do not make this any uglier than it already is. Marcus is being generous by not having security drag you out immediately. Just accept that you lost. Take the loss with a little bit of dignity and go. Chloe giggled, pulling out her phone and tapping the screen, likely preparing to text her wealthy friends about the pathetic stepmother being formally evicted from the mansion. She did not even try to hide her absolute delight. This was exactly what they all wanted. They wanted to strip me of my pride, force me into a corner, and watch me sign away my rights through a veil of desperate tears. They genuinely believed that by forcing me to sign those papers under duress, they were securing Marcus's assets and leaving me entirely destitute. I looked at Marcus. His chest was puffed out, his chin raised in a posture of absolute authority. He was staring at me with a cold, unforgiving glare, expecting me to crumble. He expected me to beg. He expected me to frantically flip through the pages, sobbing over the harsh, merciless clauses of the prenuptial agreement he had weaponized against me. Instead, I felt a deep, genuine sense of tranquility wash over my entire body. It was a profound, icy calm that completely neutralized the aggressive, toxic energy suffocating the room. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against their pathetic taunts. I simply walked forward, my posture flawlessly straight, until I was standing directly across the desk from Marcus. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents. The pristine white pages were filled with aggressive legal jargon designed to ensure I walked away with absolutely nothing. Every single paragraph was a meticulously crafted trap meant to protect his supposed wealth from my grasping hands. I slowly reached out and picked up my favorite heavy brass pen from its holder on the desk. The metal felt cool and solid in my grip. I did not read the first page. I did not scan the asset division clauses. I did not even glance at the waiver of spousal support. I simply flipped the thick stack of papers directly to the very last page, locating the blank line designated for my signature. The room fell completely silent. The mocking laughter died in Brad's throat. Chloe lowered her phone, her brow furrowing in confusion. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for a screaming match, a tearful negotiation, a desperate plea for mercy. My total, unhesitating compliance was deeply unsettling to them. I looked up at Marcus. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a fleeting, imperceptible shadow of doubt. He could not understand why I was not fighting back. He could not comprehend why a woman who was supposedly about to lose everything was standing there looking as though she had just been handed the winning ticket to a massive lottery. I held his gaze, my eyes completely devoid of fear. Then, with a smooth, decisive flourish, I pressed the brass pen to the paper and signed my name. My signature was bold, clear, and perfectly steady. I did not flinch. I did not hesitate. I legally bound myself to every single harsh, unforgiving term of his precious prenuptial agreement. I placed the pen back into its holder with a soft, definitive click. I closed the legal folder and pushed it slowly across the polished mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of Marcus. "There you go, Marcus," I said, my voice incredibly soft, smooth, and entirely unbothered. "You have exactly what you wanted. We are legally and financially separated. What is yours remains yours, and what is mine remains strictly mine." Marcus stared at the signed documents, his arrogant swagger quickly returning as he processed his perceived victory. He snatched the folder off the desk, gripping it like a hard-won trophy. He genuinely believed he had just outsmarted me. He thought my swift signature was the ultimate proof of my absolute defeat, a sign that I was too terrified and broken to even attempt a legal battle. "You made the right choice, Naomi." Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with condescending triumph. "At least you had the sense not to drag this out in court. Now, I suggest you go to the bedroom and start packing. I want you out of my house in exactly 2 hours. Chloe let out a loud, victorious cheer, high-fiving Brad. Maya shook her head, offering me one last look of fake, performative pity before turning toward the door. They were all celebrating, completely intoxicated by their own cruelty and their shared delusion of superiority. They thought they had just witnessed my total destruction. They had absolutely no idea what I had actually just done. By signing those papers without a single contest, I had legally finalized the absolute protection of my hundreds of millions of dollars in private equity assets. I had legally severed his ability to claim any marital right to the massive fortune I held in the shadows. He had just demanded and received the very legal instrument that guaranteed he would walk away from our marriage completely and utterly bankrupt. I looked at the four of them, a pack of arrogant, parasitic fools, celebrating on the deck of a sinking ship. I did not need 2 hours to pack. My encrypted drives and essential documents were already secured in a sleek leather briefcase tucked beneath my desk. Everything else in this house, the cheap clothes he loved to mock the personal items I was leaving it all behind. I did not need any of it. "Take your time celebrating Marcus," I said, offering him a breathtakingly serene smile that made his jaw tighten with sudden, inexplicable unease. "Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your house. Enjoy everything you think you have." I picked up my leather briefcase, stepping smoothly around my shocked sister and her gaping husband. I walked out of the office, leaving them standing in the room, clutching a stack of useless papers. The countdown clock was no longer ticking. It had officially struck 0, and the absolute devastating shockwave was already on its way. I descended the grand staircase with my leather briefcase gripped loosely in my right hand. The thumping bass from Chloe's daytime party was still vibrating through the soles of my shoes, but the chaotic noise felt entirely disconnected from the profound quiet settling over my mind. Marcus, Chloe, Maya, and Brad had followed me out of the office, eager to watch my final walk of shame. They trailed behind me on the stairs, throwing quiet, mocking comments at my back. Marcus was practically vibrating with victory, already barking arrogant orders at Chloe to start looking for interior decorators to completely gut and redesign my former workspace. Suddenly, the heavy, deafening vibration of the music was cut off. It did not fade out gracefully. It was aggressively killed at the source. A sharp, jarring silence fell over the massive living room. The intoxicated teenagers groaned in loud protest, but their complaints were instantly drowned out by the sound of heavy synchronized car doors slamming shut outside. It was not the rattling hum of a cheap moving truck pulling into the circular driveway to collect my belongings. It was the deep, powerful, coordinated purr of high-end engines. Chloe rushed to the towering floor-to-ceiling windows flanking the front door, her designer heels clicking frantically against the marble. "Dad," she said, her voice entirely stripped of its usual arrogance, replaced by a sudden sharp edge of pure panic. "There are police officers outside and a whole fleet of black SUVs." Marcus frowned deeply, his chest puffing out instinctively as he descended the final steps. He adjusted his custom Italian suit jacket, fully preparing to intimidate whoever had dared to interrupt his victory lap. "It is probably just a noise complaint from the miserable neighbors," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand in the air. "I will handle this. Brad, get these kids out of the living room and hide the liquor." Before Marcus could even reach for the heavy brass handle, the grand double doors were pushed open from the outside. They did not just swing open, they were commandeered. A uniformed county sheriff stepped directly into the grand foyer, his hand resting casually on his utility belt, his expression completely devoid of warmth. Behind him stood a small, highly coordinated army of men and women in sharp, immaculate business suits, accompanied by 4 burly asset recovery agents wearing dark tactical vests. The sheer presence of these people instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. The teenagers in the living room froze in absolute terror. Maya grabbed Brad's arm, her eyes wide with shock, as they backed away toward the base of the staircase. At the front of the pack was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a meticulously tailored suit, carrying a thick leather portfolio. This was Harrison, the lead litigator for Vanguard Apex, a man whose hourly billing rate was higher than what Brad earned in an entire month. He possessed the kind of ruthless, icy professionalism that routinely struck fear into the hearts of aggressive Wall Street executives. He stepped onto the imported marble tiles, his eyes sweeping the chaotic, messy foyer with deep, undisguised disdain. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. His face morphed rapidly from mild annoyance to outright explosive outrage. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Marcus roared, his voice bouncing aggressively off the high ceilings. "This is private property. You are trespassing. Get out of my house right now before I have every single one of you arrested." Harrison did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or take a single step back. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at Marcus with the exact same expression one might use when inspecting a crushed insect on the bottom of a shoe. The sheriff stepped forward slightly, creating a solid physical barrier between Marcus and the elite legal team. "Sir, I highly suggest you lower your voice and listen very carefully to what the attorney has to say." "Asambi asimi." The sheriff instructed, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. Marcus opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the sheer authority radiating from the sheriff silenced him. He stood there, his chest heaving, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Harrison calmly opened his premium leather portfolio and extracted a thick stack of documents, bound by a heavy, intimidating red seal. He held it out not directly to Marcus, but in the empty space between them, forcing Marcus to physically reach for it. "Hello, Marcus." Harrison said, his voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with absolute authority. "We represent Apex Holdings and its subsidiary Onyx Capital Solutions." Marcus scoffed, an ugly, harsh sound ripping from his throat. He aggressively swatted at the air, refusing to take the documents. "You are out of your mind. I own this house. My name is on the deed. I just refinanced the mortgage 3 months ago with a private lender. You have the wrong address, pal. I'm calling my lawyers right now, and they are going to bury you." Harrison offered a cold, predatory smile that sent a visible shiver down Chloe's spine. "Your lawyers dropped you as a client on Tuesday due to 3 months of unpaid invoices, Marcus. And you do not own this property. You executed a deed in lieu of foreclosure with your primary bank exactly 6 months ago to avoid a highly publicized bankruptcy. You then signed a strict occupancy lease with a private trust. You are merely a tenant. And as of this morning, you are a tenant in severe catastrophic breach of contract." Marcus stared at him, the arrogant fire in his eyes flickering as the terrifying reality of the legal jargon began to penetrate his thick skull. He looked at the red seal on the documents, the color rapidly draining from his face until he looked physically ill. Harrison thrust the stamped documents directly into Marcus's chest, forcing him to grab them against his chest or let them fall to the floor. "We are here with a court-ordered expedited eviction notice due to gross financial negligence, the total depletion of your required escrow funds, and the immediate documented violation of the Residential Peaceful Enjoyment Clause. Our client has terminated your lease effective immediately." Harrison gestured sharply toward the living room where the underage teenagers were currently attempting to sneak out the back terrace doors, abandoning Chloe entirely. The asset recovery agents were already fanning out across the first floor, snapping photographs of the spilled liquor, the muddy footprints on the white leather sofas, and the general destruction of the property. "You have no right." Marcus stammered, his voice suddenly weak, cracking under the immense weight of his collapsing reality. "You cannot just throw a man out of his home without a 30-day notice. The law protects me." The standard 30-day notice is entirely waived when the tenant engages in illicit activities and causes malicious destruction to the property, Harrison corrected, quoting the exact trap I had laid out in his customized lease agreement. "We have photographic evidence secured and time-stamped less than 30 minutes ago of underage drinking and property damage occurring under your supervision. The judge signed the emergency order 20 minutes ago." Harrison checked his heavy platinum watch, his gaze shifting back to Marcus with total finality. "You have exactly 2 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate our client's property. If you, your daughter, and your guests are not off these premises when that time expires, the sheriff will physically remove you, and any remaining items will be seized as collateral against your massive outstanding debt." The grand foyer was entirely silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a judge striking a gavel over and over again. Maya and Brad stood paralyzed on the bottom step of the staircase, their eyes wide with absolute horror, as they watched their wealthy meal ticket disintegrate right in front of them. Chloe's mouth was hanging open, her phone dropping from her limp fingers and clattering against the marble floor. Marcus stood frozen, clutching the eviction notice to his chest like a shield that could not protect him. His entire identity, his wealth, his power, his dominance had just been legally and ruthlessly stripped away in less than 3 minutes. I stood quietly near the base of the stairs, my briefcase in hand, and watching the glorious, devastating arrival of actual power. I had not spoken a single word yet. The entire room belonged to me. The profound silence in the grand foyer was suddenly shattered by a visceral, explosive sound of pure denial. The reality of the legal documents in his hands finally short-circuited Marcus's brain. He crumpled the thick watermarked paper in his fist, his face contorting into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. He threw the crumpled eviction notice back at Harrison's chest, his voice echoing violently off the high vaulted ceilings. "Are you crazy?" Marcus screamed frantically, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a trembling finger at the floor beneath him. "This is my house. I built this life. You cannot just march into a gated community, hand me a piece of paper, and tell me to vacate my own property. I will sue you. I will sue your entire firm. I will have the police arrest you for trespassing and harassment." The sheriff simply rested his hand on his utility belt, completely unmoved by the frantic outburst. "Sir, if you continue to raise your voice and act aggressively toward the legal representatives, I will be forced to place you in handcuffs right now." The sheriff stated calmly, "The eviction order is signed by a county judge. It is lawful, it is active, and it is going to be executed today." Marcus looked wildly around the room, his chest heaving as he desperately searched for someone to validate his delusions of grandeur. He looked at Brad, expecting his loyal subordinate to jump to his defense. But Brad was pressing himself flat against the staircase railing, looking completely terrified. He looked at Maya, who was practically trembling, clutching her designer purse, as if it could protect her from the legal nightmare unfolding in front of them. Marcus had spent his entire life bullying people into submission with his loud voice and his fake wealth. But for the first time, his aggression was entirely powerless. That is when I made my presence known. I stepped down from the final marble riser of the grand staircase, stepping fully into the bright, natural light flooding the foyer. When I had gone upstairs an hour ago, I was wearing a simple, unbranded navy dress that they had endlessly mocked. But when I packed my encrypted drives and essential documents into my leather briefcase, I had also changed my clothes. My casual attire had been entirely replaced by a flawless, bespoke charcoal gray power suit. It was tailored to absolute perfection, projecting an aura of intimidating, unquestionable authority. On my feet were a pair of pristine Christian Louboutins. As I walked forward, the iconic red soles flashed, and the sharp, distinct sound of the stiletto heels clicked coldly against the imported hardwood floor. Click, click, click. Every single step sounded like the ticking of a metronome counting down the final seconds of his fraudulent life. "It was your house once upon a time, Marcus, I said. My voice was smooth, melodic, and completely devoid of any sympathy. It sliced through his frantic screaming like a freshly sharpened blade. Marcus whipped his head around, his eyes widening in profound shock as he took in my transformation. The quiet, submissive woman he thought he had successfully dominated at the dinner table was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman who radiated raw, concentrated power. He looked from my designer suit to my leather briefcase, his mind desperately struggling to comprehend how the woman he was trying to evict was suddenly commanding the room with such absolute certainty. "Naomi, what the hell are you doing?" Marcus stammered, his arrogance faltering as deep primal confusion took over his features. "Why are you talking to them?" Harrison, the high-powered litigator whose hourly rate Marcus could never afford, immediately took a respectful step back. He turned his body slightly, deferring entirely to my presence. "Good morning, ma'am," Harrison said, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional respect. "The premises are currently being secured by the recovery agents. We are proceeding exactly on your schedule." The breath physically left Marcus's lungs. He staggered back a half step, his eyes darting frantically between Harrison and me. The connection finally snapped into place in his brain, but his ego vehemently refused to accept the impossible mathematics of the situation. "Ma'am?" Marcus repeated, his voice cracking high and thin. "Why is he calling you, ma'am? You are a financial consultant. You make $70,000 a year. You cannot possibly afford these people." I did not bother raising my voice. I did not need to. I walked directly over to the sleek mirrored console table in the center of the foyer. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily bound stack of property transfer files. These were the unredacted documents, the absolute proof of ownership that bore my legal signatures. I tossed the heavy stack of documents onto the glass surface of the console table. They hit the glass with a loud, definitive smack that made my sister Maya jump. "You should really learn to read the fine print before you sign away your life, Marcus," I said, gesturing smoothly toward the files. "That $70,000 salary you love to mock was just the operational budget for my personal assistant. I am the founder and the hidden majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex, the private equity firm that bought your toxic defaulted mortgages out from under you. Obsidian Properties, the holding company you have been desperately wiring your rent checks to for the past 3 months, is my wholly owned subsidiary." I watched the exact moment his soul left his body. His mouth fell open, his jaw practically unhinged, but no sound came out. The blood rushed entirely out of his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. He stared at the property transfer files on the glass table, his eyes tracking the bold black ink of my name, listed as the Supreme Managing Director of the Acquiring Corporation. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had not just been outsmarted, he had been completely, systematically, and legally devoured by the very woman he had spent the last 6 months treating like absolute trash. "I own this estate, Marcus," I stated, my voice ringing with total, unshakable finality. "I own the ground beneath your expensive leather shoes. I own the roof over your arrogant head. And I own the crushing millions of dollars of debt that you have been trying to hide from the world." I turned my gaze away from his shattered expression and looked directly into the sprawling living room. The recovery agents were systematically photographing the massive, chaotic mess. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the white leather sofas stained with spilled liquor and toward the dozen panicked teenagers who were currently being detained by the sheriff's deputies near the terrace doors. "When you signed that deed in lieu of foreclosure to save yourself from public bankruptcy, you signed a strict occupancy lease," I continued, my tone shifting from conversational to ruthlessly professional. "A lease that required you to maintain the property in pristine condition and prohibited any illicit activities, because you violated that lease agreement by throwing a loud, destructive party with underage drinking on the premises. And frankly, due to your consistently terrible attitude toward the legal owner of this property, I am terminating your lease immediately." Marcus let out a ragged, desperate gasp. He reached out his hands, hovering over the documents on the table, completely unable to process the magnitude of his downfall. "But we are married," he pleaded, his voice stripped of every single ounce of its former bravado. "You are my wife. You cannot do this to your own husband." "The prenuptial agreement protects me." I offered him a chilling, razor-sharp smile. "The prenuptial agreement you forced me to sign ensures that what is mine remains entirely mine, and what is yours remains yours. You insisted on those terms, Marcus. You wanted to make absolutely sure I walked away with nothing. I am simply holding you to your own brilliant legal standards. You walk away with your debt, and I keep my empire." Off to the side of the foyer, standing near the grand archway of the living room, Chloe had been watching the entire exchange in absolute paralyzed horror. Just minutes earlier, she had been gleefully commanding me to clean up after her friends. She had proudly pulled out her latest model smartphone, holding it up high to live stream what she thought would be my pathetic, tearful eviction to her private circle of wealthy, entitled friends. She had wanted her entire social network to witness her triumphant victory over the cheap working-class stepmother she despised. Instead, her live stream had just broadcasted the total humiliating destruction of her father's fake billionaire facade. Her followers were currently watching live as the terrifying reality set in that her trust fund was gone, her mansion belonged to the woman she had just thrown a bag at, and she was officially homeless. Chloe's perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently. She looked from my flawless power suit to the sheriff standing guard by the door, and finally to her father, who was currently weeping silently over a stack of eviction papers. The sheer magnitude of her ruined life crashed down on her all at once. Her fingers went completely numb. The expensive smartphone slipped from her grasp. It plummeted toward the ground, hitting the hard, imported marble floor with a sharp, sickening crack. The screen shattered instantly into 1,000 jagged spiderwebs, the digital live stream abruptly cutting to black. The loud sound of the breaking glass echoed through the silent foyer, the absolute perfect physical metaphor for her shattered, privileged reality. She dropped to her knees beside the broken phone, her mouth open in a silent scream of pure devastation, completely unable to comprehend that the fairy tale was permanently over. The sharp sound of cracking glass from Chloe's shattered phone faded into the heavy, oppressive silence of the grand foyer. I did not even look down at the ruined device or the sobbing teenager kneeling on the imported marble. My eyes bypassed the weeping girl and the broken patriarch, entirely locking directly onto the bottom step of the sweeping staircase. Brad was standing there frozen in absolute, unadulterated terror. The smug, sycophantic grin he had worn all morning when he offered to buy me black garbage bags for my clothes had completely vanished. The cheap cologne he wore seemed to sour in the tense air as the blood drained rapidly from his face. He was pressing his back so hard against the ornate iron railing of the staircase that his knuckles were turning white. Next to him, my sister Maya looked as though she had just seen a ghost, her hands covering her mouth to stifle a panicked gasp. I took a slow, deliberate step toward them. The sharp click of my Christian Louboutin heels echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Brad physically flinched. "Oh, Brad," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost pleasant volume that carried effortlessly across the vast space. "You have been awfully quiet for the past 5 minutes. That is quite a change of pace from this morning." "I believe your exact words were that I was fumbling the biggest bag of my life and that I would be scrubbing floors to pay rent on the south side of the city." Brad swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, stammering apology, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He looked wildly at Marcus, hoping his boss would somehow miraculously rise from the ashes and shield him from my wrath. But Marcus was currently leaning heavily against the mirrored console table, gasping for air like a drowning man who had just realized the ocean had no bottom. "Did you honestly think Marcus was the one paying your salary?" Brad, I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Did you truly believe this man possessed the capital to keep that failing brokerage firm afloat while simultaneously funding his luxury car leases and country club memberships?" I turned my attention back to my husband, who was staring at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. His chest was heaving, and a thick sheen of cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. "Marcus, you really should have paid closer attention to the commercial real estate market," I continued, my tone shifting into the crisp, ruthless cadence of a corporate executive. "While you were busy screaming at me in the dining room last night, my fund was finalizing a separate, entirely independent transaction. We did not just buy the bad debt on this residential mansion. Vanguard Apex officially finalized the acquisition of your bankrupt brokerage firm at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." Marcus let out a strangled, guttural sound. He took a stumbling step forward, reaching out a trembling hand as if he could physically stop the words from leaving my mouth. "No!" He wheezed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "No, you cannot do that. That is my company. I built that firm from nothing. You cannot take my business." "I did not take your business, Marcus." I corrected him sharply, my eyes locking onto his with absolute zero mercy. "You destroyed your business. I simply purchased the wreckage from your creditors for pennies on the dollar. You have been insolvent for over 8 months. You leveraged your entire corporate portfolio to cover your disastrous personal investments. You took out massive unauthorized loans against the firm's operational budget just to maintain the illusion of your wealth." I gestured to Harrison, the lead litigator standing stoically near the front door. Harrison smoothly unzipped the secondary compartment of his premium leather portfolio. He extracted a second stack of documents, these bound in a stark, warning yellow folder. He stepped forward and placed them firmly on the glass table right next to the eviction notice. "But financial incompetence is not a crime, Marcus," I said, stepping closer to the table. "Desperation is not a crime. What is a crime, however, is how you chose to cover up those massive financial holes." The color completely vanished from Marcus's face. He knew exactly what I was about to say. The desperate, panicked realization in his eyes confirmed every single suspicion my forensic accountants had uncovered during our due diligence phase. When my auditors accessed your internal corporate servers this morning, they found glaring, catastrophic discrepancies in your client ledger, I stated, my voice ringing with total, undeniable authority. You are not just losing money, Marcus. You are actively stealing it. You have been systematically siphoning funds from your high-net-worth clients' escrow accounts to cover your margin calls. You misappropriated millions of dollars of client capital to pay for this fake, luxurious lifestyle. Marcus staggered backward, his legs visibly shaking. He hit the wall next to the console table, sliding down slightly as the sheer gravity of his crimes was exposed to the open air. The sheriff standing by the door immediately straightened his posture, his hand dropping to his radio, clearly recognizing that this eviction had just escalated into a major corporate fraud investigation. As the new majority shareholder and acting chief executive officer of the acquiring firm, I am exercising my absolute authority. I announced, my voice echoing like a judge, delivering a final devastating verdict. Marcus, you are officially fired. You are stripped of your title, your access credentials, and your equity shares. Furthermore, my legal team has already forwarded our audit findings directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the federal authorities. You're not just facing bankruptcy today. You are facing decades in federal prison for grand larceny and wire fraud. Marcus let out a loud, agonizing wail. His knees finally buckled completely. The arrogant, tyrannical patriarch who had slammed his hand on my dining table just hours ago collapsed entirely onto the imported marble floor. He pulled his knees to his chest, weeping openly and pathetically in front of his daughter, his employees, and the armed law enforcement officers. His grand illusion was dead, and the reality of a prison cell was staring him directly in the face. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply turned my gaze back to the staircase where Brad was currently hyperventilating. Brad let out a panicked squeak, holding his hands up defensively. "Naomi, listen to me," he stammered, his voice pitching into a desperate, frantic register. "I had nothing to do with that. I swear to you, I am just the junior sales director. I just sell the portfolios. Marcus is the one who handles the executive accounts. I did not know he was stealing from the clients. You have to believe me." I offered him a chilling, perfectly composed smile. "I do not have to believe anything, Brad. The digital paper trail tells the entire story." I walked slowly toward the base of the stairs, closing the physical distance between us until Brad was forced to look directly into my eyes. "You may not have orchestrated the embezzlement, Brad, but you absolutely facilitated it. My auditors found your digital signature on over 24 falsified transfer authorization forms. Marcus needed a compliant, spineless subordinate to process the fraudulent paperwork without asking any difficult questions. He chose you because he knew you were too desperate for his approval and too eager to live a wealthy lifestyle to ever scrutinize the numbers." Brad's jaw dropped open. He looked wildly at Maya, who was now staring at her husband in absolute, unadulterated horror. Maya had married Brad because she thought he was on the fast track to becoming a millionaire broker just like Marcus. She was just realizing that she had actually tied her entire life to a disposable corporate pawn who was about to go down for a massive federal crime. "I thought we were family." Brad pleaded, hot tears of absolute terror welling up in his eyes. "Naomi, please, we are family. You cannot send me to prison. I have a wife. I was just doing what my boss told me to do. We stopped being family the moment you sat at my dinner table and mocked my upbringing to impress a thief." I replied, my tone completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "You hitched your wagon to a criminal because you lacked the talent and the work ethic to build your own success." I took a step back, surveying his trembling, pathetic frame with total disgust. "Brad, you are officially fired immediately for being a direct accomplice to corporate fraud. Your severance package is non-existent. The company car you leased under the corporate account is currently being repossessed from the driveway. You have zero income, zero assets, and zero protection. My legal team has drafted a cooperation agreement. If you willingly testify against Marcus and provide the federal investigators with everything they need, we might consider not naming you as a primary defendant in the civil lawsuits. But your career in finance is permanently, irrevocably dead." Brad let out a loud, gasping sob. He reached out blindly, clutching the iron staircase railing to keep himself from falling. His knees gave out and he sank down onto the carpeted steps, burying his face in his hands. He wept loudly, his entire body shaking as the glorious, wealthy future he had envisioned instantly evaporated into dust. Maya let out a sharp, terrified scream, backing away from her husband, as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease. She looked from Brad crying on the stairs to Marcus sobbing on the marble floor. The two powerful, wealthy men she had worshipped and prioritized over her own sister were completely, utterly ruined. They had been exposed as nothing more than pathetic, desperate frauds. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by the absolute destruction of their toxic, arrogant lives. I had not laid a single finger on any of them. I had not raised my voice or lost my composure. I had simply used the truth, the law, and my own hidden power to tear down the fake empire they used to oppress me. The purge was complete. The house was mine. The company was mine. And the justice I had quietly promised myself the night before had been delivered in absolute, devastating perfection. The heavy silence following my absolute dismantling of Marcus and Brad was suddenly broken by the sharp, authoritative voice of the sheriff. He tapped his radio, giving a brief code, and signaled to the deputies standing near the grand archways. It was time to clear the property. The officers moved into the sprawling living room with practiced zero-tolerance efficiency. The wealthy, entitled teenagers who just moments ago had been drinking stolen liquor and laughing at my expense were now scrambling like terrified mice. They grabbed their expensive jackets and designer bags, practically tripping over each other to escape the terrifying reality of the law enforcement presence. Chloe remained frozen on her knees next to her shattered phone. Her brain was completely unable to process the total catastrophic collapse of her universe. A female deputy approached her, placing a firm professional hand on her shoulder and instructing her to stand up and move toward the exit. The physical contact snapped Chloe out of her catatonic state. She erupted into a violent, shrill tantrum that echoed off the high ceilings. "Get your hands off me!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she slapped wildly at the deputy's arm. "You cannot do this. Do you have any idea who my father is? This is my house. You cannot kick me out of my own home. I will have your badge for this." The deputy did not flinch. She simply tightened her grip smoothly and effortlessly, hauling the thrashing 19-year-old to her feet. Chloe kicked and screamed, her designer heels slipping wildly on the imported marble floor. She looked desperately toward the foyer, her face smeared with ruined makeup and tears of absolute panic. "Dad!" she wailed, reaching her hands out toward Marcus. "Dad, do something! Tell them to stop! Tell them who you are!" Marcus did not look at her. He could not even lift his head. The man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable black excellence was currently curled into a pathetic ball on the floor, destroyed by his own financial crimes. Chloe was forcefully marched past him, her screams of protest growing increasingly hysterical as she was dragged out the heavy front doors and shoved out onto the front lawn. Her wealthy friends were already speeding away in their luxury cars, abandoning her entirely to the consequences she had so arrogantly mocked just minutes before. Watching his precious, spoiled daughter get physically escorted off the premises by armed police finally broke the last remaining shred of Marcus's massive ego. The realization that he possessed absolutely zero leverage, zero money, and zero power hit him with the force of a physical blow. He slowly uncurled himself from the floor. His custom Italian suit was wrinkled and stained with his own cold sweat. He did not stand up to face me like a man. Instead, he crawled. He moved across the marble floor on his hands and knees, dragging himself toward the tips of my pristine Christian Louboutins. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, his face contorted in a mask of sheer, unadulterated desperation. "Naomi, please." Marcus begged, his voice a pathetic, trembling whisper that sounded absolutely nothing like the tyrant who had screamed at me in the dining room. "Please, you cannot do this to me. I will lose everything. The feds will lock me away for decades. I am your husband." We stood in front of God and our families and took vows. For better or for worse, remember, this is just a rough patch. I was stressed about the market. I did not mean any of those things I said to you. We can fix this. You are my wife. You have to protect me. He actually reached out his trembling fingers, hovering just inches from the fabric of my tailored suit pants, desperate to cling to me like a lifeline. He was using the very institution of marriage that he had relentlessly weaponized against me as his final pathetic excuse for mercy. He thought he could invoke the sacred bond of a partnership he had never once respected, hoping that my fundamental decency would override his blatant criminality. I did not step back. I simply looked down at him, my expression completely unbothered. A faint, genuinely amused smile touched the corners of my mouth. "You just said it yourself, Marcus." I replied, my voice smooth cold and entirely devoid of pity. I quoted his own arrogant words back to him, delivering them with razor-sharp precision. "What is yours is yours. What is mine is mine." His eyes widened in fresh horror as he realized I was throwing the exact terms of his precious prenuptial agreement directly into his face. "You shoved those divorce papers across my desk this morning with a massive smile on your face." I continued, leaning down just slightly so he could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "You demanded that I sign them, and I did exactly what you asked. The papers are fully signed, Marcus. We are legally separated in the eyes of the state and entirely severed financially. The empire I built is completely insulated from your catastrophic failures. You will not get a single cent from me, not for your debts, not for your legal defense, and certainly not for your survival." Marcus let out a low, agonizing groan, his forehead dropping to rest against the cold marble floor as the absolute finality of his doom washed over him. He was completely and utterly alone in the wreckage of his own making. Before I could even straighten my posture, the heavy front doors were pushed open again. My mother, Valerie, rushed into the foyer. She had apparently just arrived in a taxi, responding to a frantic text message Maya had sent her earlier about my impending eviction. Valerie was wearing her Sunday best, her face flushed with panic as she navigated past the sheriff's deputies and the sobbing Chloe outside. She burst into the room expecting to find me in tears, begging for a place to stay. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks. She took in the surreal scene unfolding in front of her. She saw Marcus, the wealthy son-in-law she worshipped, crying on the floor like a broken child. She saw Brad hyperventilating on the staircase. She saw the elite corporate attorneys and the asset recovery agents, and right in the center of it all, she saw me wearing a flawless designer power suit, completely commanding the room. Maya, who had been pressing herself against the wall in sheer terror, instantly recognized the shifting power dynamic. The survival instincts of a true parasite kicked in with breathtaking speed. She violently shoved herself away from the staircase, physically stepping over her weeping husband Brad, as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded trash. "You lying, disgusting snake!" Maya suddenly screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Marcus. Her voice was shrill, filled with entirely fabricated righteous indignation. "How dare you! You manipulated all of us. You lied to our family. You pretended to be a legitimate businessman, and you were just a common criminal stealing from innocent people." Valerie's eyes darted frantically around the room, her brain working in overdrive as she processed the property transfer documents resting on the glass console table and the sheer authority radiating from my posture. It took her less than 5 seconds to calculate the new financial reality. The man she had praised was bankrupt and heading to federal prison. The daughter she had constantly belittled was secretly sitting on a multi-million-dollar fortune. Valerie's entire demeanor flipped with such terrifying speed, it almost gave me whiplash. She aggressively marched over to Marcus and kicked him squarely in the side of his leg with her sensible church shoes. "Get away from my daughter, you absolute fraud!" Valerie hissed, her face twisting in disgust. "I always knew there was something fundamentally wrong with you. You arrogant, thieving monster. You thought you could trick us with your fake luxury cars and your stolen money. You are nothing but a disgrace." She turned away from the sobbing man on the floor and rushed toward me, her arms opening wide, her face instantly morphing into a mask of overwhelming, tearful maternal pride. "Oh, Naomi," Valerie cried out, her voice dripping with thick, sugary flattery. "My brilliant, amazing girl, I am so incredibly sorry. We had absolutely no idea he was doing these terrible things behind your back. You were so smart to keep your success hidden from a predator like him. I have always said you were the most special person in this family. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness." Maya rushed up right beside her, violently nodding her head in agreement, completely abandoning the man she had married. "She is right, Naomi. We are your blood. We are your real family. We only took his side because he manipulated us and threatened to cut us off. We were just scared of him, but you defeated him. You are so strong. We are so incredibly proud of you." I stood perfectly still, watching my mother and my sister desperately try to rewrite history in real time. Just hours ago, Maya had told me to get on my knees and beg for life. Valerie had dug her nails into my arm and commanded me to apologize to a teenager to protect her social standing. They had happily offered me up as a sacrifice to the altar of Marcus's fake wealth. Now they were swarming around me like desperate flies, aggressively cursing the very men they had worshipped, all in a frantic, pathetic attempt to latch their parasitic jaws onto my newly revealed fortune. I raised my hand a single sharp motion that instantly silenced their frantic, desperate flattery. The absolute audacity of their sudden pivot was sickening but entirely predictable. They were parasites, simply looking for a new host to drain. "You can save your breath," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that left absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. "You can go follow this fake billionaire right out the front door. I have no family willing to sell me out for dirty money. You chose your side at the dinner table last night. You made your loyalties perfectly clear when you told me to get on my knees and beg a criminal for scraps. I am not a bank, and I am certainly not your safety net. You are no longer welcome in my home. Get out!" Valerie opened her mouth to argue, her face twisting in sudden indignation, but a stern warning look from the sheriff completely shut her down. Maya let out a pathetic, whimpering sob, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her own greed. They were swiftly escorted out of the grand foyer by the deputies joining Chloe on the front lawn in their collective, humiliating ruin. I stood near the base of the staircase and watched the final, pathetic act of Marcus's downfall. The police gave him and Brad exactly 2 hours to gather whatever basic personal items they could carry. It was a miserable, humiliating spectacle. Marcus, the man who demanded absolute respect and submission, was reduced to stuffing wrinkled dress shirts into a generic duffel bag under the watchful, unblinking eyes of armed law enforcement. He wept openly, a broken, empty shell of a man who knew a federal prison cell was waiting for him. Brad was no better, frantically packing his meager belongings while continuously sobbing about his ruined life. They were entirely stripped of their dignity, their stolen wealth, and their arrogant illusions. When the 2 hours were finally up, they were marched out the heavy double doors, leaving their keys resting uselessly on the glass console table. The heavy oak doors clicked shut for the final time. The police cruisers and the fleet of black SUVs rolled out of the long circular driveway, taking the toxic remnants of my past with them. The camera of my mind slowly dollies out, capturing the absolute tranquility of the moment. I walked into the sprawling, magnificent living room. The recovery agents had already removed the trash and cleaned the temporary mess left by the careless teenagers. The massive space was completely silent, immaculately clean, and entirely devoid of the heavy, suffocating contempt that had plagued it for the last 6 months. I walked over to the custom white Italian leather sofa and sat down, smoothing the fine fabric of my flawless suit. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling estate that was entirely legally mine. Sometimes to defeat those who look down on you, you do not need to scream. You do not need to throw a tantrum or beg for their respect. You just let their own arrogance completely blind them while you quietly buy the very ground they stand on. True power is never about how loud you can yell to prove your worth. It is about how, with a slight nod and absolute patience, you can watch their entire fake world collapse.